All right. Hello, 502 class. Welcome to our presentation, Intersectionality of Power, Privilege, and Oppression and Empowerment as it relates to age, with an emphasis on the social issue of elder abuse. One of the novel assertions that our group will be making in this presentation is that because the elderly population of the United States of America is growing rapidly and is expected to continue growing over the next several decades, the issue of elder abuse by caregivers is one that deserves the focus and attention of social workers. The quote that you see here on the first slide is from an article by Blemen et al. I feel that this offers an appropriate introduction to our topic. The quote states, "I think it's a power trip that people, in terms of if they feel inferior, it helps their self-determination to hurt someone lower than themselves." Now, this quote comes from an article which is particularly focused on elder abuse among the LGBT community, but the sentiment expressed, I feel, is applicable to the wider issue of elder abuse as it relates to all members of that population. The abuse of an elder by a caregiver is fundamentally a gross display of power and oppression that leaves the elder feeling vulnerable, isolated, and depressed. In many cases, the abused elder is without a viable network of support. In my portion of the presentation, I will begin by explaining the 7 main types of elder abuse. I will follow this by discussing trends in our country's life expectancy rates and how the elderly population grew to be the size that it currently is. I will follow this with a breakdown of statistics regarding elder abuse and why the gathering of statistics on this issue can be problematic. I will also address some of the risk factors that impact the likelihood of elder abuse, as well as some of the legislation and enactments that aim to address this issue. Next slide, please. So, according to our main text this semester by Sue, Rashid, and Rashid, elder abuse is defined as intentional actions that cause harm or create serious risk of harm to a vulnerable elder by a caregiver or other person who stands in a trust relationship to the elder. The 7 main types of elder abuse, you can see them on the slide. Physical, this could be anything, beatings, any kind of physical violence. Sexual abuse, molestation, inappropriate touching. Emotional abuse, financial exploitation, neglect, abandonment, and self-neglect. Now, these 7 types of abuse do not exist independent of one another. Physical abuse also has an emotional component. Sexual abuse and neglect are physical abuse. They are forms of violence, for example. If you hear a story on the news of a nursing staff not moving elderly patients, not turning them in bed, they develop bed sores, they're in pain. This is a type of violence. Financial abuse is also emotional abuse. It can result in psychological trauma, depression, feelings of helplessness, and so on. Next slide, please. So some information on changing demographics and the life expectancy trends. So in 1900, the average life expectancy in the United States was 46.3 years for male and 48.3 years for female. Over the next 120 years until today, so these numbers had grown significantly over the last 120 years. Our life expectancy in the US now is 75.1 years for male and 80.1 years for female. This is according to data pulled from UC Berkeley. These numbers are an average across racial and ethnic demographics. In actuality, the life expectancy for African American and Latinx populations has always been a few years shorter than for Caucasian. Worth noting is that in the year 2020, the average life expectancy actually went down for the first time in over 100 years. And this is due primarily to the impact of coronavirus, particularly on the elderly population of our country. In 2019, adults 65 and older comprised approximately 16% of the population, and this number is projected to grow to over 21% by 2040. The elderly population is roughly equally divided between rural and urban locations, but as you can see, the population is slightly higher in rural areas. Ages 65 and up account for 17.5% of the population in rural areas and 13.8% for urban areas. Some of the major factors contributing to the historic growth of the US's elderly population, first and foremost, is the longevity of the baby boomer generation. These are individuals born after the end of World War II, the generation between 1948 and 1964, as well as numerous scientific and medical advancements of the 20th century. Chief among these medical advancements that accounted for an uptick in life expectancy, this was particularly between the 1920s and 1950s, was the development of penicillin, which was the first major antibiotic of its kind. It was discovered in 1928 by Alexander Fleming. It was made widely available to the public beginning in March of 1945. Alexander Fleming was also awarded the Nobel Prize in medicine for this discovery. So you have availability of penicillin, and you have advancements in medical technology and procedures, things like sterile surgical treatments. You have the development of neurosciences. All of these working together helped to greatly increase the life expectancy and the longevity of the baby boomer generation, which was already, I believe, the largest generation born in the United States. Some of you might remember President Clinton declaring 1990 to be the decade of the brain. It was during this decade where there were huge advancements made in the understanding of brain function and neurobiology, and that contributed greatly to the longevity of the elder population. Next slide, please. So on to some statistics about elder abuse. According to research I found by Taravel and Rabin, approximately 1 in 10 cognitively intact older Americans experience abuse. This number jumps to an astonishing 47% of older abuse, or 47% of older adults with a cognitive impairment who experience some form of abuse. The statistic here speaks to the intersection of elderly age and ableism, which I will elaborate on shortly. According to Taravel and Rabin's research, the global prevalence of elder abuse sits at somewhere between 7 and 15%. So depending on where in the world, the numbers can be higher. Taravel and Rabin, their research showed in parts of China, the rates of elder abuse were significantly higher, almost 36%. There were parts of Africa where elder abuse was far more common, or parts of the world where elder abuse was far less common. But generally speaking, the prevalence of elder abuse sits at between 7 and 15%. But global statistics on elder abuse, like those in the United States, they reveal significantly higher rates of abuse for those elders with cognitive or physical impairments. Bringing in our course concept of ethnocentric monoculturalism, implicit beyond the idea of the dominant culture being defined by white heterosexual men of European ancestry, there is also this thread of what's called rugged individualism. One of the previous groups had shared on this, I believe, 2 weeks ago. So it's this idea of, doing everything for oneself, of not asking for assistance, sort of, manning up and getting the job done. And high cultural emphasis is placed on productivity. So those who are able to produce capital more effectively have a higher standing within the ethnocentric monocultural viewpoint. Because many of the elder population are at or are past the age of retirement, their status as non-working, and so their inability to continue producing or producing capital for their society, it puts them lower on the power and privilege hierarchy when looking through the lens of ethnocentric monoculturalism. Potential risk factors for experiencing elder abuse include a cognitive or physical impairment, which I spoke about minutes ago. Also, the lack of community support and membership in the LGBT community, which I will discuss later in the presentation when I speak about the intersection of elder abuse and membership in the LGBT community. Also, having a financial relationship with their abuser can be seen as a significant risk factor, particularly for elder abuse of a financial nature. If the elder is financially dependent on the caretaker, that can breed animosity, feelings of animosity, which can contribute to elder abuse. If the caretaker, say it's a child or a relative, and they are financially dependent on the elder, that can also be a risk factor. They can, they can swindle the elder, subject them to financial exploitation. One of the major problems, though, with collecting accurate data about elder abuse in the United States and globally is that many instances are underreported. Again, according to Taravel and Rabin's research, they concluded that it may be as few as 1 in 24 cases of elder abuse are actually reported to the authorities. Rather shocking, I feel. So, but there have been a number of legislations or enactments to address elder justice and to combat elder abuse. First and foremost was the Social Security Administration, which was created in 1934 by President Franklin Roosevelt. One of the main aims of the Social Security Administration was to bring a growing number of elderly people out of the poverty, which was caused by the Great Depression, which had dominated the previous, the Great Depression began in 1929. So in response to this increased poverty, Roosevelt created the Social Security Administration. According to the Social Security Administration's website, in 1937, there were approximately 53,000 beneficiaries receiving a total of $1.2 million. By 2008, these numbers had grown to 7.5 million beneficiaries receiving more than $43 billion. There is also the National Long-Term Care Ombudsman Project, which was established in the late 1970s. This was an agency that was created to protect residents of nursing homes, care homes, and assisted living facilities. Every state is required by the Federal Older Americans Act to have an ombudsman program. In 1999, there was a Supreme Court decision, the Olmstead Supreme Court decision. Now, this did not specifically relate to protecting the elderly. Rather, it ruled that segregation based on disability status was unconstitutional. This measure was then co-opted by elderly populations to advocate for those with physical disabilities. We also have the Elder Justice Act of 2010. This was the first major comprehensive initiative to specifically combat elder abuse. So some of the facets of this law, this was a very wide-reaching law. It provided a number of state and federal grants. These were spread out throughout multiple states, New York, California, Texas, Illinois, et cetera. State and federal grants to enhance adult protective services. The Elder Justice Act also created a consensus guidelines for adult protective services and established the first national adult maltreatment reporting system.
All right, so now that we have kind of the background on elder abuse, the demographics, the statistics, I'm going to move into the relevance to social work. And so as this is a growing issue, it's becoming more relevant to social work. As Max stated, the Elder Justice Act was passed in 2010, becoming the first comprehensive legislation to address the abuse of older adults at the federal level. So that was only 11 years ago. So this really is a pressing issue that we need to address and advocate for. So as we've talked about in class and from Sue, Rashid, and Rashid, this ties in the social justice perspective. And so striving for fairness and equality, ensuring opportunity to all human rights and equality of opportunity. It pulls into the NASW Code of Ethics. As social workers, the primary mission of the social work profession is to enhance human well-being and help meet the basic human needs of all people, with particular attention to the needs and empowerment of people who are vulnerable, oppressed, and living in poverty. So as Max shared earlier, as time is passing by, the life expectancy is growing older. We're staying alive longer, and we are needing more support as our bodies begin to regress with our older age. Through this process, it is common for us to rely on others for help or support. Elders become more vulnerable to abuse from caretakers at this time. This loops us back to the Code of Ethics. Our job as social workers is to enhance the well-being, but also help meet basic needs of all, especially empowering those who are vulnerable. Before I move on, I do want to highlight what basic needs consist of, as we have talked about in class and throughout this course, but we can identify basic needs as things such as food, water, clothing, sleep, and shelter. All right, so moving along to elder abuse during the COVID pandemic. So the COVID pandemic is an issue that we are facing right now, and for the past 2 years almost, that has accelerated elder abuse. So it has increased during the COVID-19 pandemic, according to the World Health Organization. As Max touched on risk factors, social isolation is also a risk factor of elder abuse. And so what we have seen is at the beginning of the pandemic, elders who were in nursing homes or care facilities were locked in their room, told they couldn't come out, couldn't socialize with anybody. They didn't have contact with anyone outside of their rooms, besides maybe the people who were dropping off their food. And so that social isolation has really been a part in accelerating the elder abuse during the pandemic. And that is a huge risk factor that we are seeing today. We also have seen the discharge of symptomatic elderly patients at hospitals. So elderly patients at the hospitals who are positive COVID-19 cases and they're still symptomatic are being discharged and returning back to a nursing home or the care facility. And this is disregarding the high risk of infection spreading. These issues can be related to things such as insurance policies. We know that elderly are one of the most vulnerable populations when it comes to COVID, and due to policies such as insurance or policies of nursing homes, there's a chance that the insurance is only covering a specific number of days in the hospital. And at that point, the insurance policy is taking over the needs and the rights of the elders. So then, speaking on policies, talking about COVID-19, it's important to look at the political attitudes towards elderly in the face of the pandemic. In March 2020, Lieutenant Governor of Texas, Mr. Patrick, said that the elderly population can take care of themselves and suggested that grandparents wouldn't want to sacrifice their grandchildren's economic future. This is extremely alarming in knowing that our political figures are more interested in our economy than the life and well-being of our elders who have helped build that economy to where it is now. So for advocacy, what can we do as social workers to advocate for the needs of our elders, especially those who are facing elder abuse? Well, we can utilize advocacy strategies. So we can meet with officials. So meeting with officials of our town or local governments, starting at that micro meso level, and working our way to the state and federal. We can also testify at public hearings at cases of elder abuse. So as social workers, we do have the cool opportunity of actually having relationships with our clients and understanding them at a personal level. We hear their stories and how their experiences directly impacted them and their state of well-being. We also can educate communities on human rights and highlighting the rights of older adults. As adults become our elders, a lot of their human rights seem to be taken away from the public eye or diminished. And this is highlighted in employment a lot. So employment opportunities are not equal for elders. It's often harder to find and get a job at an older age. This makes it extremely difficult for individuals who have not been able to save for retirement and still need some sort of income in their later years of life. If you have not saved for retirement or you did not have the type of career that allowed you to save for retirement, it's a determining factor of where you can live and what kind of health insurance you can afford outside of Medicare or Medicaid, such as supplemental insurance. The idea of human rights as it relates to elders loops back to care for elders and the importance of acknowledging what kind of care elders will be able to receive, and the importance of making sure that it is in a safe home or facility for the individual. We can also encourage older adults to be their own voices to advocate, since we do have the cool opportunity to have those relationships with our elders. Encouraging and empowering them to advocate for their own rights is just an incredible way to get the reality of elder abuse into the community. And then we can advocate at each level of practice of social work. So in the micro level, we can help clients understand their rights and eligibility. And what I mean by that is eligibility in regards to policies or issues such as home care. So helping individuals know what kind of care they're going to be able to afford, what kind of care their insurance will take care of, if it's going to be at home care or a nursing home. So really to get the chance for elders to receive proper care and at least give some help to maybe family members who are taking care of them, which will eliminate the abuse that happens in the home, even just by taking the caretaker, giving them a few hours a day or a week away from taking care of the elder. In the meso level, we can work with clients to make sure they have access to available health services. So we have the opportunity to make sure these services are accessible and reliable for the needs of our clients, and that they are truly getting what they need. And then in the macro, we can help in the development of policies. So recognizing poor policy decisions that are happening and shift our focus towards the harm that is inflicted on the elder. Providing framework for social workers to develop a critically engaged practice to take action against harmful policies. All right, so what can we do today? We can talk a lot about how we can advocate, but it starts with being able to start as soon as possible. So again, we can advocate for policy change. So something that's really important is in the micro, starting with understanding the abuse that elders experiencing and how a policy might affect elders in the same community. Understanding how the one policy impacts many people in the same area can be really important, and knowing where to change a policy or where to add principles into it. In the meso, we can work within the local level to make a difference in policies that are harmful or perpetuating elder abuse. And then in the macro, again, the development of policies, working at the government level by understanding what is happening, especially through the micro and meso levels. We can also educate ourselves on signs of elder abuse. Just as we look to understand signs of child abuse, elders are just as vulnerable to abuse as children are. And just like children, sometimes they don't have the opportunity or the voice to stand up against the abuse that they're experiencing. We need to understand personal biases. So acknowledge personal attitudes and prejudices towards aging, understanding where we're falling short of elders and older adults' experiences, and just understanding our biases is really important to taking that first step into working with elders. And then finally, cultural competence. So as we have talked about in Sue, Rashid, and Rashid, cultural competence is especially important because when it comes to elder care, different communities, different cultures have different attitudes on taking care of their elders. For some, it is a privilege and an honor to take care of their parents and their grandparents. For others, it is seen as something they didn't think they were going to have to do, and it turns into more of a burden. And that's where we need to be incredibly aware of the different cultural aspects that a client may come in with, because we need to understand where someone is coming from when they have a view on taking care of an elder or putting them maybe in a care facility. So being culturally humble towards others' own lived experiences can allow us to understand how elders age and the abuse they face intersects with different aspects of their life. So now I'll hand it over to Conrad as he highlights different aspects of intersectionality and the relationship of elder abuse.
When studying and investigating elder abuse, acknowledgement of the intersectionality of different identity factors a elder may possess is vitally important to fully understanding the experience and treating any negative impacts that elder abuse may be having on one. Now, with that being said, intersectionality is possibly the most plentiful in elder abuse, as it is in any case, as no matter what, between all humans, everyone will hopefully get old at one day. As Max highlighted, the average life expectancy is different across different racial groups, which is an unfortunate aspect of our society that can detract from the ability to age and to get to this point. Elders are particularly vulnerable, as not only are their bodies becoming more frail and their minds become less sturdy with time, but additionally, as Camilla has pointed out, they possess less ability to advocate for themselves and less avenues for that, all of which will be highlighted as different aspects of one's identity can make particular aspects of the aging process more damaging to one's ability to maintain themselves and to avoid elder abuse than others. With that being said, intersectionality between the factors of gender, of culture, of socioeconomic status, of one's sexuality, all of these have different aspects that they focus on, and different aspects where their differences really highlight the wide variety and horrible truth of how much elder abuse can and does persist in the world today. Now, next slide, if you would not mind. Now, one's experience of elder abuse can vary by the gender. Older women traditionally and statistically have less financial resources available, are more likely to be widowed or live alone, and are more likely to live in a residential care setting. On the flip side, older men are less likely to have a supportive network, are more likely to be dependent on a spouse or caretaker, and often have greater financial resources. I'm going to focus on the financial resources part first, as those keen of you may have noticed that the opposites were present in both genders. Having less financial resources for older women puts older women at a particular point where they are more likely to be reliant on state programs, Medicare, Medicaid, and as such may not have as wide a choice or as great a level of care in their ability to interact with medical systems. This can lead to older women being stuck in situations that are abusive that they simply cannot escape, be it a residential setting that does not properly take care of the elder's needs, or with a government mandated caretaker who is abusive in some way. Because of the limited financial resources, these are situations that often are much, much more difficult for older women to escape from. On the flip side, the greater financial resources of older men are often an attractor for financial fraud, specifically caretakers, family members, etc., siphoning off the funds and misusing them for personal gain of the elder, which is a very large problem, especially when an older man may be a bit of an attractive target for these types of fraud in this case. I will continue on the factors of older men at the moment. A supportive network can not only be a protective aspect, as there would be more people to care to notice any signs of abuse, there will also be more people available to talk to. As such, it is considered that elder abuse is much more highly reported among women than it is men, as men often do not have someone to report it to, someone they are close enough to report it to feel comfortable reporting, as women do, as often older women maintain closer social circles, are more likely to have a larger family network for which they can garner support. Similarly to the aspect of older women having less financial resources, older men are much more likely to be dependent on a spouse or a caretaker. Levels of injury are higher within older men, although marginally, but given the traditional views of building a home that many of the baby boomer generation grew up in and built their homesteads in, older men often are less competent in household tasks, cooking their food, doing their laundry, those sorts of daily chores. And as such, if they don't have a spouse or they never learned how to do it themselves, a caretaker externally is necessary, opening up significantly more possibility to abuse, as it is a situation they cannot just walk away and leave from. It is something they require, a basic necessity of life for them. Jumping back to the category of older women, being widowed and living alone, as it is with a supportive network, a lack of a supportive network for older men simply means that they aren't going to have people to talk to. They don't have people available to them such that they can fight, report, whatever they want to do to challenge the elder abuse. Residential care settings as well can be controlling. And as Camilla highlighted with the COVID-19 pandemic, can completely isolate someone from any network, any protective network they can have. If I could get the next slide, please. With that being said, elder abuse is, particularly as it is experienced by the individual, the elder, is most dependent on their culture. In this case, how an elder sees their instance of abuse, whether or not what we may consider to be abuse is abuse, these are all dependent on the culture an elder was raised in, as is their willingness to fight the abuse, to take action to change it. Across the research from Li, Chen, and Dong looked at elder abuse in Chinese nationals and in white, African American, and Latino populations in the United States. There are many differences between these cultures and how they perceive elder abuse. In the case of Chinese individuals, they tend to have a lower standard of what constitutes elder abuse, such that simply being disrespectful would be considered abuse, whereas it highlighted among people who where corporal punishment is much more common, much more socially acceptable, especially in Black communities in the United States. There are higher standards for what constitutes abuse, as sometimes a physical violence as a punishment is more socially acceptable. With that being said, researchers often look at an inventory of items to determine whether or not abuse is present within a certain situation, such that they can have an objective list that contains all the items that a researcher is looking at to determine prevalence of abuse. Different types of abuse are more common across cultures as well. This mainly has to do with the traditional structure of the family. In families of Chinese, Black, and Latino elders often have a much higher focus on generational love, for lack of a better term, and generational support. As such, elders may live with their children, they may live with their grandchildren, nieces, nephews, whatever of the sort, much more often in these cultures. And as such, abuse from their family is the most common form. Additionally, the likelihood of one to report abuse is additionally very linked to this family dynamic, especially if the abuser is a member of the family. In Latino cultures, elder abuse is often seen as something that should be worked out within the family, that should be kept under wraps and should be treated within family interventions rather than outside help. In Chinese culture, elder abuse is often seen, although much worse, as much more embarrassing for the elder, as a bit of shame on them, and oftentimes will go grossly unreported. With that being said, there are additional protective factors that one's culture can provide. Stronger family ties, as are present in the research's citations of Chinese, Black, and Latino families, do lead to lower rates of elder abuse. It is much less likely that a family member is going to commit elder abuse than a caretaker. Although it still can happen, having strong ties across generations can open up a family to higher levels of interpersonal support and stronger ties to help prevent abuse and discourage it among family members that may consider it due to financial need, just out of a stronger familial bond. If I could get the next slide, please. Thank you. And finally, for my section, looking at the intersection of elder abuse and socioeconomic status is a bit of a fascinating tidbit of research itself, although there is very limited research in the topic. That being said, it puts ethnocentric monoculturalism a bit on its head, especially in the case of white male elders who their entire lives have been benefiting off the rewards of ethnocentric monoculturalism and are suddenly thrust into a position due to the natural process of aging of being outside of what is considered to be the norm from this viewpoint. This leads them to be in a more vulnerable position than they would normally be. Now, with that being said, socioeconomic status plays into this as the factors of socioeconomic status, what is considered higher education levels and higher income, both lower one's risk of experiencing elder abuse to a substantial degree, such that the rich who are educated, who have a large variety of savings to pay for the best treatment for their conditions, the best care in a residential setting if need be, are significantly less likely to encounter settings where elder abuse is common. Those with these higher education levels and higher incomes are generally more protected from elder abuse. They can buy their way into better care facilities and better medical treatments, such that they don't need to risk caretakers who have their own financial pressing needs that would lead them to be either abusive to their patients or commit financial fraud against them. Now, with that being said, lower socioeconomic status tends to lead to much higher risk of financial abuse, oftentimes because there is lower education levels present in lower socioeconomic status families. Elders in these communities in lower socioeconomic levels aren't as able to manage their own finances and require either family members or caretakers to manage them for them, which opens up a great possibility of fraud, as oftentimes the elders wouldn't even know it was occurring due to their own financial illiteracy. On the flip side, physical abuse is much higher, relatively speaking, to those in a high socioeconomic status. This can be considered as there is more financial literacy, there is more ability to know when one is being swindled or defrauded, and as such, lower incentive to try, which brings physical abuse to be a much more prevalent case. That isn't to say that there are more cases in higher socioeconomic status groups. There are still more cases of physical abuse in lower socioeconomic status groups than high, but simply because of the lack of financial abuse cases in higher socioeconomic status elders, physical abuse becomes the most prominent one. With that being said, Max is now going to speak on the intersection between LGBT identities and elder abuse.
Yeah, so just talking briefly about this intersection of elder abuse in the LGBT community. So many LGBT elders grew up in an era where society was much less tolerant of different sexual orientations. For a lot of them, it's a common source of stress, in older adulthood, the fear of discrimination due to their sexual orientation. According to the article by Webb et al., older LGBT individuals are more likely to live alone, less likely to have children to help care for them as certain elderly needs may arise. This means an increased reliance on medical professionals and care facilities. Here is a quote from the article by Blemen et al. Quote, "I find that a lot of us are isolated and ostracized by our families. So when we have to depend on nursing homes and medical facilities, and we don't have anybody to advocate and come and visit us to make sure that we're all right and that things are going fine for us. Those are the times when we are abused. You see it happening all the time, you know, riddled with bed sores because nobody cares. Nobody's visiting, nobody's taking heed to what's happening to the older adult in the community. Some LGBT elders in the study by Webb et al. Described being fearful of discrimination or insults by professionals during home visits, opting to quote unquote de-gay their homes in order to appear more heteronormative. Webb et al. Went on to describe this process in tandem with the common fear of discrimination faced by LGBT elders. For many, the fear of ridicule or discrimination causes them to overtly suppress their homosexuality. Passing as heterosexual then is seen as something of a lifelong defense mechanism. Also mentioned was the fear of police involvement. This is also from the Blemen article. The quote here, if you have to call the police and they come and it's SGL, which means same gender loving people, they think it's a joke. A common complaint reported in the Blemen article included staff not listening to the advice or complaints from a long-term same-sex partner, either explicitly not listening to or ignoring the input or ignoring the advice of that partner. Since the individual is a same-sex partner, the couple may not be legally married. Of course, same-sex marriage has been the law of the land since the Obergefell-Hodges Supreme Court decision. But that is not always, if you're not getting legally married, you know, you have less financial rights, you know, joint accounts and joint assets and things of that sort. Here we can draw another line to ethnocentric monoculturalism and to the power and privilege which is found in the heteronormative same-sex marriage community. So next slide.
And our question for discussion for you all today is as follows. Your friend Catherine asks for your advice. Her grandmother, Susan, lives with Catherine's cousin, Joel. And when Catherine visits, Susan's room is always a mess and isn't in a state where Catherine thinks her mobility impaired grandmother can navigate it. Susan told Catherine that she asks Joel for help cleaning, but he works long hours and is never available to help. Despite Catherine's insistence, Susan doesn't see anything abusive in the situation. What advice would you give Catherine regarding this situation? What should she say to her grandmother? Should she say anything to her cousin? We leave that up to you, and we look forward to seeing your answers. With that, our last slide is our references. Thank you all for watching.
Thank
We
you.
hope to hear from you.
Thank
And
you.
have a wonderful day, everyone.